So welcome to another gardening video with LICA. Today we're going to talk about Organic Gardening 101. So in this video, we're going to go over some of the real basics of organic gardening, what organic means, why we do organic gardening, and how we can implement it in our gardens. And before we dive into it, I just want to say that LICA and our community garden is located on and benefits from the traditional lands of the Dene-Sulane and the Nehya, and is in the heart of the Métis homeland. So LICA respects and honors our responsibility to truth and reconciliation as members of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 2. So let's just jump right into it. What does organic even mean? So organic from that biology standpoint or that science standpoint is a scientific term, and it means any compound containing carbon-hydrogen bonds or being derived from living matter. And so applying that to agriculture, organic agriculture means the food grown without synthetic agents or chemicals like traditional fertilizers or pesticides. So organic certifications for those kinds of agricultural producers, they rely on those producers to follow a number of standards. But for our purposes and the way we integrate organic into our community garden, is that organic gardening is about recreating those natural and complex relationships between living organisms in the soil and the plants. So it's about learning and emulating those systems that occur in nature to create the best possible environment for your produce to thrive. Organic gardening also considers the conservation of resources like water as a part of kind of that environmental sustainability portion of organic gardening. So why should we implement organic gardening in our lives? Well, there's lots of reasons to consider growing an organic garden. So one, by avoiding the use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, we are ensuring that we're not contributing to pollution in our air and our water. So for example, in conventional agriculture, when we lay down lots of fertilizer, it's washed off of all of those plants. They just can't absorb it fast enough. So it's washed off of our gardens, our fields, and our lawns, and those nutrients are washed into our watershed, so into our lakes and our rivers. And for our region in particular, excess nutrients leads to algal blooms and poor health in our water bodies. So if you hate blue-green algae, organic gardening is one way that you can combat that. Conventional agriculture also tends to use pesticides, which have a negative effect on pollinators and insects that are really beneficial to our garden. So by allowing the soil and the plants to do those natural processes without chemical interference, we are growing healthy plants in healthy soil. And we'll talk a little bit more about pesticides later in this video. So chemical fertilizers are typically made up of three things, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's why you see NPK on your fertilizers. It's telling you how much of those three elements your fertilizer contains. And plants require these three nutrients in relatively high concentrations, so we call them macronutrients. Macro meaning big. Plants also need some micronutrients, for example, calcium or magnesium, to grow nice and healthy, but in relatively small amounts compared to the macronutrients. So diving right into these guys, nitrogen is a really important component of chlorophyll. So it's really necessary for doing photosynthesis. It also helps with vegetative growth, keeps your plants really nice and green, and it keeps your leaves big and retaining lots of water so they're not wilting. Phosphorus, it helps plants store and use their energy. And it also contributes to fruiting and flowering, so those kind of reproduction parts of the plant's life cycle. So phosphorus is kind of balancing what nitrogen is bringing to the table. Nitrogen is doing a lot of that vegetative growth, helping with that, and phosphorus is doing a lot of that reproductive growth, so flowering and fruiting. And lastly, potassium. Potassium is for strong roots, nice, thick, healthy roots that grab onto the soil. It also helps the plants resist disease. So if I'm not using a fertilizer to add those 3 macronutrients to my soil, how am I going to do that? Well, for example, you can add compost. This is kind of the gold standard of organic gardening. Essentially, what we're doing with compost is breaking down dead plant matter into really rich soil. And that's exactly what's happening out on the forest floor. Plants die, they decompose, and the surrounding plants take up all those nutrients to grow back bigger. You could also feed your plants manure. Manure is great too if you have a farm or you have access to it. You do want to compost it first and let it break down, or it could be a bit acidic for your plants. But manure is also a fantastic compost. We could talk about aquarium water. It's full of nitrogen from the fish swimming around in there. So you can put that on your houseplants or on your garden. Coffee grounds, these raise acidity. So if you have low acidity in your garden, coffee grounds are a great way to add that back. And also wood ash, crushed eggshells, those will lower acidity. So if you have very high acidity, you're going to want to add some crushed eggshells or some wood ash. Fish waste is also really great. It's full of magnesium, and it's great for tomatoes. Tomatoes are kind of these like very hungry plants. They need a lot of macro and micronutrients to thrive. As an aside, that's why you see like tomato specific fertilizers at the garden store. It's because the nutrient concentration is really, really high, and it won't do well with other plants, but it does well with tomatoes. So fish waste, I would definitely add that in where my tomatoes are growing to give them that extra boost. Lastly, banana peels. You know how if you get a leg cramp, you're supposed to eat a banana to up your potassium? Same thing applies to plants. So if you add banana peels to your compost or you make banana peel tea, that's going to add a lot of potassium to your soil. So here I have a few recipes for different organic additives you can make for your garden to up the nutrients. So I'm going to get you to pause the video right now to write these down. Okay, so you have all those recipes written down. You know how to add some of those extra nutrients to your garden. You can also make your own compost. We're not going to dive too deep into compost today. We have some other workshops that you're more than welcome to attend if you want to dive deeper into compost. But I just wanted to show you a few examples of things that you can add to your compost that will increase those essential nutrients to your garden and to your plants. So things like cardboard, coffee grounds here, grass clippings, eggshells, food waste, tea bags, shredded office paper or newspaper, just no gloss, no kind of magazines, and then wood ash and leaves, things like that. These are all really great options to add to your compost pile and create your own fertilizer. And if you don't have your own compost pile at home, you can always add these things, these organic wastes, to our compost pile at LICA's Community Garden in Bonnyville here. And you can also attend one of our vermicomposting workshops to learn how to compost indoors with worms. So things you should not put in your compost. And please don't add them to ours either. So things like meat scraps, dairy products, and oils and lards, they cause problems with odor and also with pests. Scavenger animals are really attracted to things like meat bones. So we don't recommend you put those in your compost if you don't want a problem with pest animals. We would also recommend don't add any diseased plants. This is a tree with a gall here. Just because that can spread in the soil and get onto your vegetables when you're putting your compost back in your garden. Also charcoal and feces, so animal feces, human feces, don't add that to your compost. It can be harmful to your plants and harbor some nasty bacteria. So I just don't recommend adding these kinds of things. So we just talked about some of the ways we're going to add nutrients into our garden. Now we're going to move on to pests. How do we control pests when we're not using things like pesticide to get rid of them? One of the most important parts about keeping your garden organic is really trying hard to avoid the use of pesticides. They really do contribute to the pollution in our waterways, and they also kill beneficial insects and beneficial microbes in our soil that we want to encourage to support our plants. The best method for pest management is prevention. So taking the time to plan your garden and ensure that where you're planting each kind of species will be strong and healthy and happy will deter pests. You want to test your soil and tweak those soil conditions one at a time to observe changes. And you also want to properly maintain your plants, so prune them, weed, thin as necessary. If you do these things and you take care of your garden, your plants will be strong enough to prevent pests on their own. They will fight back. Also, you might want to consider co-planting some buddy plants. So for example, add a few marigold into your garden, your food garden. And you also want to avoid monocultures. So you don't want to plant a whole plot of just one species. That will encourage pests and it will also encourage disease. So if you're doing everything you can to prevent pests, you will have a really good chance of avoiding them altogether. However, sometimes they still do manage to get in. So when those pests get in, what are we going to do? How are we going to do organic pest control? Well, there's three sort of methods. So cultural control, one, that's what we just talked about with the prevention portion. Doing that prevention, keep your plants really nice and healthy and well maintained, and they will fight back on pests. Physical pest control, that includes things like using barriers, for example, row covers or stem netting, or you can manually remove pests by hand or with a jet of water. Spray them right off of your plant. And lastly, the third method is biological pest control. So with this, we're inviting beneficial insects and animals into our garden to help take care of pests in a natural way. So adding a birdhouse, adding grassy areas for snakes in your lawn. Things like this are all ways we can get animals to do the hard work of pest control for us. There is also the option of inoculating your garden with bacteria or fungi. One example is BT. You can read the name on the screen. I can't pronounce it. But BT is a naturally occurring caterpillar bacteria. It's been commercialized as an organic pesticide. There isn't really too much evidence about lasting effects on the environment or in humans. But that being said, adding anything extra to your garden should be used as a last resort when there's other methods that are available and effective. Now let's talk about a few of the common pests you're going to see as you're learning to garden organically. So aphids. These are tiny little insects that love to feast on the sap of plants. These are relatively easy to get rid of, so a strong jet of water will usually take care of them. They're also the main prey for ladybugs, so encouraging those beneficial insects to come to your garden will help control the aphid population. Even like praying mantids and ladybugs, you can buy those commercially for your garden, making sure that you're not buying an invasive species. But those are a really good way to introduce beneficial insects. Another method is insecticidal soap, and I'll just show you a recipe for that. So to make insecticidal soap, you're going to need natural soap or Castile soap. Dr. Bronner's is pretty environmentally friendly, so that's why I have the picture up for them. Doesn't have any additives or anything like that. And what you're going to do is you're going to mix the soap with water and a little bit of vegetable oil just shake it up or stir it and you're done. I like to put this stuff in a spray bottle for ease of use. Just makes it super easy to apply it to your plants. And how this soap spray works is that the fatty acids in the soap, they dissolve the exoskeletons of the aphid. So it's a very dramatic method of pest control, but it's very, very effective. Also works on things like spider mites and mealybugs. And it does need to be reapplied over time, but I would wait 3 to 4 days between applications to not stress the plants out. So when you apply it, you might see a little bit of wilting. So kind of what you want to do is do like a skin test where you would test a new product on one small portion of your arm. You're going to want to apply the soap spray on just one small leaf or 2 leaves and just see how the plant reacts before you spray it all over the place. Next, we have carrot rust flies. Carrot rust flies can scar root vegetables. It makes them inedible, unfortunately. Floating row covers, if you install them early in the season, early in the spring, those can prevent the flies from laying their eggs. And you also want to do some destroying. So destroy the plants that attract rust flies. Things like Queen Anne's lace, that can really help reduce the carrot rust fly population. Also, I don't recommend composting your infected carrots if you do get rust flies, because you put them in your compost and the rust flies kind of incubate and wait for the next time you're going to put them near some carrots. You also might want to consider rotating where you plant your carrots each year, because again, those rust flies can live in the soil and just wait until they have another carrot to infect. Cabbage worms, super familiar with these little worms that live in our gardens. They look like these little green velvet caterpillars, and they can be found as these little white or yellow oblong dots under the opposite side of the leaf, so on the underneath side. That's their eggs. They feed on our leafy greens, so our cabbage, our lettuces, things like that. And they contaminate the produce that they're feeding off of with their feces. So there are a few ways to combat these guys. One is that studies show that red-leafed varieties are less likely to have these worms because of the lack of camouflage. So the worms are green, they want to be on green plants so that predators don't see them. So you can plant red-leafed varieties, and that might reduce your cabbage worms. You also can plant trap crops like mustard or nasturtiums, and these can attract these worms, and they'll go away from your cabbage, and then you can pick the worms off of the trap plant, or you can just pull out the trap plant and put it in your compost. Herbs like thyme also deter them, and you could also use rye flour sprinkled on the leaves. That'll dehydrate the worms. So lots of great strategies to get rid of cabbage worms. Now, tent caterpillars. These are the bane of Albertans' existence. They create tent-like webs in the crooks of trees, and they can defoliate those trees and leave them really susceptible to disease. So with these guys, there are a few safe methods. One, you can manually remove the caterpillars while they're still eggs. That tends to be the most effective. And then you could use BT in the nest, that big web that the caterpillars are creating. That's another way to combat them. The good news is that they only show up every few years, so it's not a reoccurring thing that you have to manage in your garden. Lastly, we have slugs. Slugs are gross. Pulling them out by hand is the most effective way to get rid of them, but it's gross. What you can do is make a trap with stale beer in a shallow pie tin, and that can attract and drown these guys. You just want to make sure that the edge is not flush with the ground, or you could harm some other insects that get into that stale beer. Crushed eggshells or copper edging also make a really good barrier against slugs. And our cats. This one's a pest and a pet at the same time. We all love our cats dearly, but we don't really appreciate when they use our garden as a giant litter box. Aside from that being gross, wandering cats can also carry toxoplasmosis. That will make lots of people sick. So how are we going to prevent that? One, you can cover the soil with some prickly items. The little cat paws, little beans on the bottom there, they're quite sensitive. So putting things like eggshells, pine cones, twigs on your garden will deter them. If you want to go with a scent deterrent, you can try planting lavender or lemon thyme, or you can put out some cinnamon sticks, citrus peels, or coffee grounds on the soil. Another thing is that if male cats are marking your garden, you want to make sure to wash it away and prevent them from coming back, as they mark the same spaces over and over again if they can smell their own scent. So if a male cat is marking your garden, do wash it away with a big jet of water. So sticky traps are not organic, even though they're a physical pest control method. They are not organic. Whether they be fly strips or tree trape or mouse traps, they are not organic because they often trap animals and insects that they didn't intend to do, and that causes harm and often death for that animal. There's lots of alternatives. You only want to be catching the things that are not benefiting your garden anyway, so I avoid sticky traps altogether. All right, so we went over some of the basics of organic gardening, what organic means, how we implement it, and some strategies for that. And we also went over pest control options when you're not using pesticides, and talked about the pests that you're most likely going to be dealing with when you're growing an organic garden. So I want to say thank you for listening, and please tune in for more gardening videos from LICA. They're definitely on the way. Have a great rest of your day.